This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today is our July edition of Incentives and Instincts, a recurring series in which I speak with economist and friend Bryce Ward about some of the broader challenges facing our society. Bryce, how are you today?
I'm feeling pretty good, Justin.
Feeling pretty good. Midsummer is here. You and I talk a lot about problems in this series, and it's important to not lose sight of the many good things that are indeed happening. And right now, a lot of things are improving. We're making progress on crime, inflation, labor force participation, household net worth, and debt. Yet it remains tempting to believe that everything is awful. Bryce, let's take these in order. Violent crime and murder in particular are dropping at a steep rate this year, at least the recent data that's been pulled together. Yeah, what's happening in violent crime right now?
It takes a long time to get the official statistics, but there are some cities that report them in real time.
Yeah.
And there are researchers who then track those cities in real time. So for a set of like 90 some cities, we can see exactly where we're at year over year. And
does that include like some of the bigger cities that people think of when we think of the state of crime in the country?
Yeah. Those things drive a lot of the,
Sure.
our perceptions of crime, if not necessarily always the reality of crime. The median for this set it's down 12%. It's a lot. It's still higher than it was pre-COVID, but it's, after the spike up, it's a big spike down.
Yeah.
And in some places it's down, a ton, and in some places it's still going up. But, in the past, this has been a reliable indicator of what we'll see when we get the real data next year or whenever we get it. So, it's certainly an indication that normally crime drifts down, but this is like a big up, big down. It's a little bit, anomalous in terms of what we tend to see in crime data, but the spike was also anomalous.
Right. The pandemic was a weird time, and it just sort of coincided with the George Floyd murder and the associated protests and so forth. So a lot was in the tinderbox at that stage. And is that kind of the leading candidate for explanations? Is that we had this weird spike and it's going to be mirrored with a weird decline?
We never really understand crime. We don't really understand why it spiked up so much. And therefore we probably don't really understand why it's coming down so much. I think the leading hypotheses are a mix of things.
Yeah.
So first, we're renormalizing ourselves post-COVID. I think it's easy to underestimate just how much psychological weirdness came with restrictions and masking and isolation, all that kind of stuff. But there are some potential policy explanations, right? Police officers or police departments have been re-engaging. They've been changing strategies. They've been responding to the problem.
Sure.
And this is why it's hard to ever explain it, is when violent crime spikes up, it generates a response, even if that spike was driven by some underlying transitory shift in society. So now we have two things happening at the same time, and makes it, or actually more than two, but makes it hard to then say, well, why is it going down?
And a lot of motivated reasoning in the commentary around it. So like as an economist with the skills in data analysis, you must sort of enjoy being able to try to derive some signal from all the noise out there.
Yeah, that's what you try and do. And that's where, ultimately, to the extent that anyone's going to answer the question, they will take advantage of the fact that it's not going down at the same rate everywhere and try and then parse out that. But then, there's always idiosyncratic things, right? Like, Memphis had a high profile. It was Memphis had a high profile, some form of thing that led to a bunch of protests. And, and Memphis has had higher crime now, higher violent crime this year. So there's some things that kind of happen, so it's harder to kind of ultimately parse all of it out. But there are a lot of people who study crime and presumably will get at least their attempts at answers over the next few years.
Yeah. Do we have any clues as of yet? You said police were changing some of the ways they were engaging the problem. Do we have any idea some of the leading strategies that appear to show promise at this stage?
At least some of what's been talked about was police also responded during COVID and maybe also to the protests by not enforcing as much. So there's just a return to some enforcement. There's pushing to try and, let's enforce all of the stuff or whatever it is. And so, that's one thing that I have seen.
Sure.
I think it will take a lot longer for us to really unpack it. And look, we should be clear, right? This is based on 5 months of data.
Yeah. Too early to really know much.
And so hopefully it continues to fall over the rest of the year, and we end up somewhere closer to where we were pre-pandemic. But, there's still a little ways to go, even with the 12% decline over the first 5 months.
Encouraging regardless of why at this point.
Yeah. I mean, violent crime is bad.
Yeah. We don't want it.
We don't want it.
Yeah. Second thing, inflation. We want some. We still have probably more than we want. And inflation was up as high as 8-9% year over year. We've seen that come back to earth a little bit. Where is it now, and why is this maybe happening?
We've got a million different numbers that get thrown around, right? If we just look at straight up headline inflation, it got up to 9%. It's now close to 4%. The recent Federal Reserve Board minutes and the stuff that accompanies that suggests that the Fed is expecting that over the next half of the year, it's going to be in the high threes.
Yeah, and this was the first cycle the Fed made no change.
Yeah, they took a break.
Quite a while.
They took a break. Is that our 2% target? No. Mm-hmm. It's no longer if you go back a year, inflation was a big deal.
Yeah.
People were super mad about it.
It was like one of the primary pieces of the conversation heading into the midterm election.
3.8% inflation is still probably too high, but it's kind of tolerable.
Yeah.
It's not outside the realm of like, oh yeah, we've never seen that before, or we haven't seen it in a long time. And most importantly, at least in May, it was at a level where wages actually grew faster.
Yeah, and that's key. Wages needed to catch up to some degree.
If wages are growing faster, so real wages, inflation-adjusted wages are positive, then people are okay. I'm okay, right? It was the 2 years of real wage declines, right? Where wages were going up, but inflation was going up by more.
Right. Yeah, if consumers, individual households and businesses with high rates of inflation, they can't plan as well for the future. They don't know what that future looks like necessarily. There's more uncertainty. It's more expensive. It's just harder to make long-term planning decisions under that regime.
Yeah, and we also feel bad because it doesn't match our expectations. Right. Like you go to the grocery store or you go to the gas station, suddenly things are more expensive than what you think they should be.
Yeah.
And they're changing rapidly. That's when people start complaining, right? But when it's kind of like, within a range of, okay, yeah, some things get more expensive, things are kind of going up. And they're still going up at a rate that is unpleasant, but it's half of what it was, or less than half of what it was a year ago. You really noticed it a year ago.
Yeah. You noticed it between shopping trips a year ago.
Yeah. And in particular, like grocery inflation is basically zero right now. Gas prices are well within the normal range of what we're used to. Mm-hmm. So they're not the ones that ultimately drive the number,
right?
But they're the ones that people that drive perception are much more under control. Mm-hmm. And, I think that there is some expectation that it will continue to drift down a little bit. At some point, we're going to have to face how do we get the last % or so out of the system if we really do want to get back to 2%, because that seems like it's been a little harder. And you ask at some point, well, what's changed? And a lot of what's changed is as we came out of COVID, or at least started getting vaccinated after COVID, the supply chain was messed up.
Yeah.
And that was half of inflation, and a lot of those inflationary pressures have gone away. Mm-hmm. What's driving the most recent declines is we're also seeing housing prices stabilize. They're not going up, and in some cases rents are coming down.
Yeah, and some of the supply has been able to catch up, building and so forth. And then, as you mentioned, supply chain. I mean, there's been some. I don't know if it's accurate to say deflationary categories, but as businesses were trying to figure out their supply chains, in some categories, overcorrected. So now you go into businesses and they have an overabundance of inventory, and that can put downward pressure on prices as well. You'll see more sales and more clearance items and so forth.
That's right. And so, there's been a bunch of stuff that's kind of balanced out, normalized. It's no longer just like, oh, what's the crazy thing that, there are still crazy things out there. And I don't mean to say that everything is hunky-dory relative to the acuteness of the crises that the series of crises that we've been living in for the past 3 years. We're back to a period where we're not just crisis to crisis to crisis.
Right.
And that's kind of what's I think, motivating this topic is we're kind of looking around at things that were really
Yeah.
acute.
Yeah.
And it's like, we're just not, it's not great. Inflation at 4% is not great.
But it's better than 8, 9.
But when it was 7, 8, 9 and going up,
Yeah.
that was really hard.
Yeah. Let's just do a couple quick hits on other things that seem to be going okay. Labor force participation rate is a number you track closely. That appears to be on the rise recently.
So in particular for prime age adults, so 25 to 54 is what we call the prime age. And, it's fully recovered from the COVID downturn. It's above where it was in 2019.
It's great.
It's almost back to literally the record highs that we reached in the late 90s. There's still some issues, in the above 55 labor force participation and maybe in the below 24 or 25 labor force participation. It's strong. Labor market is strong. There's certainly no evidence of weakness there. And, that means good things for most people.
Yeah. People can change jobs. They can, they have more bargaining power as workers and so forth. And that, is maybe connected to some degree to the rise in net worth that we've seen recently. You mentioned real wages before moving in the right direction. So maybe these things coalesce to a little bit easier net worth.
That's also partially the housing price.
Housing prices,
But so, if you look at just even going back to the trends that existed before COVID, and you just say, well, where would we be in terms of total household net worth? We are above where we expected to be at this point in time. We are actually a little below where we were maybe a year or two ago.
Okay.
But we're still up, right? We're still kind of on net above where if we had just kind of continued without a COVID shock, just continued on the trend that existed for many years beforehand, we're slightly above trend in terms of net worth. And then we're below trend in the things that kind of are kind of the opposite of net worth: debt, delinquency in debt, mortgage delinquencies, credit card delinquencies. And some of these were kind of at the typical good times levels.
Sure.
And some of them were below those levels, and some of them were, kind of right around the typical. But like we're definitely not in a state of, it's the Great Recession and all that's elevated, or we're in some sort of, crisis period. There's a margin of people who are struggling more than is typical or common during, relatively good times.
We'll be back to our conversation with Bryce Ward after this short break. A New Angle is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and UM's College of Business. Access to capital, broadband, and education are 3 ingredients any community needs for success. Hey folks, on August 11th, A New Angle and The Right Question are teaming up for our first live event at the Wilma Theater.
Justin and I will be helping the legendary David James Duncan launch his new novel, Son House, a book 16 years in the making.
Lauren and I will chat with David. David will read, and renowned singer-songwriter Jeffrey Foucault will illustrate Son House in music.
Montana Public Radio presents this evening of story, song, and conversation, August 11th at the Wilma Theater in Missoula.
Get your tickets now at logjampresents.com.
Hi, this is Sheila Stearns, Commissioner Emerita of the Montana University System and former president of the University of Montana. You are listening to one of my favorite podcasts, A New Angle.
Welcome back to New Angle. I'm here with Bryce Ward discussing some of the more positive signs in our economy. And so as we were preparing for this month's episode, we've been digging into some pretty meaty issues and some pretty grim issues. Why are Americans dying at higher rates? Other dysfunction in our society that we've been kind of covering in an intensive way the last few months. We had a little bit of difficulty coming up with a topic. And I think that stems from our kind of difficulty sort of remembering that some things are going well in society. And it turns out that effect that we sort of experience within ourselves is consistent with pretty robust finding recently in psychology. A paper published in Nature showed that, I think overwhelmingly is a pretty accurate word to describe the findings, but a survey of over 500,000 people across 59 countries, 235 surveys show that in general, people think that humans are now less kind, honest, and ethical than they were in the past. And it kind of, I mean, there are a whole host of things that stream from that, but that's a pretty interesting finding.
Yeah, and it's again these 235 studies with 500,000 participants. It's like 59 countries covering 70 some years.
Yeah.
So things used to be better, is I think the way to frame it, right? The golden age of the past is a human phenomenon, in that we are constantly just primed to think that things today are terrible and they used to be better. And so it's kind of worth, and that's part what motivates this episode was, me just looking around and being like, if I'm looking at the headlines in the news right now, they are pretty trivial.
Yeah, that's an interesting indicator, right? Like you mentioned all the attention that was paid to those folks lost in the submarine. Now, certainly a horrible thing and horrible tragedy, but I think you described it as several rich folks doing something really dangerous.
Yeah,
kind of what it was. 5
people died doing something that's inherently super dangerous.
Yeah.
And it was the main story for days. That tells me that there's nothing pushing on that, right?
Nothing pushing that off the headlines.
Nothing pushing that off the headlines. And we go through these periods, all the time, but it's an indicator to watch. Right. And then to check yourself and be like, look, again, there are always big, systemic, huge problems in the world. Poverty, malaria, climate change, these things that we try and work on and we try and make marginal progress to improve. Those are always going to be there. There are always nascent problems, things that are happening literally right now that in 20 years will be like, oh yeah, that was the thing.
Yeah, like Bluetooth causing cancer.
Yeah.
No, I'm just planting that. You never know.
Well, AI, right? Like that's the one that's dominating a lot of stuff right now. But so there's always those.
Yeah.
There's also then just the current acute crisis. Those are common. Mm-hmm. It is not uncommon to have acute crises. Now they vary in degree, but these are, the easiest ones are just natural, but like natural disasters.
And that's often how we're taught history. Is crisis to
crisis,
war to war, natural disaster to natural disaster. These exist in our teaching of history oftentimes at the high school level as the sort of...
That's what you do. It's
hinge points of our instruction.
What are the key dates? The key dates are when there was a war or where there was a recession or where there was a pandemic or, so we just move from acute crisis to acute crisis. And some of them rise to the level that they will be in history books. Others do not, but they don't, and they feel significant in the moment. And again, we've basically been buttressed by acute crisis pretty much nonstop, at least since March of 2020. There hasn't been a lot of, hey, things are pretty good, right? There isn't an obvious thing for me to be immediately concerned about. There's lots of obvious things for me to be concerned about on the nascent stuff and on the systemic big stuff. But in terms of like, oh, there's an immediate thing that I need some sort of policymaker or some entity to be actively engaged in trying to manage, solve, whatever it is, we're kind of in a lull. And yet, again, survey after survey after survey says that right now, even right now, everything sucks.
Yeah, and a couple of things there that really stood out. When you read a finding like that, surveys telling, researchers that people think we're in decline, that everything sucks, that people are worse today than they were prior, all this nostalgia. One, that effect is robust across a lot of different countries over a broad period of decades.
The earliest study is 1949.
Yeah, so it's a robust sample. And it's easy when you hear that finding in general to sort of chalk it up to our current media environment, our current level of discourse, social media, political polarization, all those sorts of things. But those cannot be the sole explainer. I mean, maybe they contribute to the findings recently, but across 59 countries, those variables differ hugely, and they differ, across the time horizon of the study as well. So interesting that generalizes in such a powerful way. The other thing that stood out to me is it's not consistent. Well, one, it's not consistent with the facts on the ground descriptively, but it's also not consistent with people's self-report of their own experience, right? in their own worlds, people self-report that, things are generally getting better and that they're experiencing kindness among their neighbors and within their community. So their view of this sort of nostalgia-based view of us in decline isn't squaring with people's own expressed opinions of their own lived experience.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? It's one of these fascinating things of the human brain is if it's one thing if I'm like, yeah, my life is bad. And then I extrapolate from that to my community is bad,
Sure.
my society is bad, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what we find, right? We find overwhelmingly people think my life is actually okay. Something like 90% of Americans say they're happy, right?
Yeah.
Or some form of happy, right? But if I ask you, well, what share of Americans are happy? You're going to say 50%.
Sure.
Right? Or if you ask me, well, how are you doing financially? I think 2/3, 70% say, yeah, I'm doing okay. At least okay. Some say I'm thriving. This kind of, I'm fine, but everything is terrible is just so weird, but seemingly ubiquitously human. And it's not just now. And it's like, again, it'd be one thing for us to be like, I'm fine, but everything is terrible now. But things today are still better than they used to be.
Sure.
But this notion, this new layer of finding of, we all just think that the past used to be better with no objective evidence. And worse, people will reject the evidence if you provide it. This is a different study from a while ago. Prior to the COVID run-up in crime had plummeted over the course of our life, right? So from the early 80s through 2020,
steady decline.
It, half to a third, depending on what you're looking at. And and in particular, like you're asking about kids safe, kids today are safer than they have, injuries, kidnap, all that kind of stuff. They are safer than they have ever been, at least until very recently. But when you try and present that evidence to people, they just reject it.
Yeah.
They do not believe it.
Yep.
And that's fascinating. And look, the psychologists in the paper, they have hypotheses for why this is. We have a short-run negativity bias and a long-run positivity bias.
And we have a self-positivity bias as well.
Yeah, and
so that might explain our tendency to think we're doing okay.
Yeah, but it has very interesting implications for how are we supposed to design our media environment? How are we supposed to design our institutions? How are we supposed to design our society if we can't be trusted to properly evaluate the world? It's hard to say, well, then how are we supposed to manage things if we are constantly subject, or at least many of us are subject to this view that things used to be better, but they weren't?
Yeah, it kind of is the first finding that, to me, in marketing, it's pretty well established that negative marketing is not effective. It's better to promote your product and your value proposition than it is to tear down your opponent. Yet in political advertising, the opposite is seen as effective. Maybe not more effective than positive messaging in politics. It's a little difficult to actually do those studies. This might explain how political messaging has morphed into, and our elections in general have morphed into, every time you vote, it's a choice of the lesser of two evils. We're trying to staunch the decline by avoiding the outcome we don't want.
The partisan brain is very weird. Another study that just came out recently presented people with various news stories or whatever it was, but they paid them to evaluate them. So you got paid more if you evaluated it correctly, if it was true or false.
Wow.
And what they found was that when there's money on the line, people are massively better at distinguishing truth from reality.
So that dampens motivated reasoning.
It dampens motivated reasoning. And yet, when it comes to sharing things, the thing that gets me whatever reward I'm seeking in a social media environment is to share things, which it turns out that if you pay people, they know they're false. But if my co-partisans will like them, I will share them, right? And so this is part of the problem, right? Is that we have this notion of we're operating on this human level of, I want negative, right? The negative isn't persuasive. It's that what a lot of the studies on social media have found is people like to hear negative things about their opponents. So it's not that I'm persuading you that this guy is a bad guy.
Yeah.
I'm just tapping into my own co-partisans' love of feeling superior to somebody else.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think is what's going on.
Yeah.
It's easy to weaponize my own bias towards nostalgia by talking about how great things used to be at some totally unspecified time with no actual empirical evidence of, and people used to do this all the time, right? Like when Donald Trump's running around saying, make America great again, well, when was it great? Right? There were questions. Right. People did surveys. Well, when was it great? Right? And
sure.
then, you throw out some period, and then you would, if you go to that period and like pull up like newspapers.com and I say, well, let's look at that period.
It wasn't so great.
It wasn't so great. Like, let me show you the advertisements for the products that they were buying and what they were paying for them. And let me show you what life expectancy was, whatever you want to look at. Right? Now, look, we've talked about long-term trends. There are real long-term troubling trends, right? In terms of loneliness, engagement in community, feeling like I have a place in a community, right? Like, I feel like that's one of the things that we've created a massive material wealth. And that material wealth does lead to people being better off in terms of subjective well-being and all that kinds of stuff. But there's this kind of ugly side over here of, people who are isolated, they feel alone, they don't feel part of a community, they don't feel part of a neighborhood. As I look at my own kids, right? That's what I want them to find. I want them to find the thing that is like, that's where they get their confidence from, because it's like, oh, I have this thing to offer. And, and that changes over the course of your life. But, how do you survive high school? You survive high school by having a thing where, a community. I'm on this group and I have this to offer this
Find
group.
your tribe.
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
And, it's easy to look at high school as the microcosm of I want that too as an adult. I want to have a role to play within some, nebulous thing that I define as my community. This is what I have to offer. And, I feel like, part of where things may actually be worse than they were. And, maybe this is what drives some of these findings.
Sure.
Is it's easy to take for granted all the things that are better, but I'm still feeling this kernel of something being worse. And for a lot of people, it may be that they're not feeling like they're a part of a community, that they have a role, a valued role of contributing to. And so, I don't want to dismiss and say, oh yeah, everything's hunky-dory, there is no problems. But it certainly is weird that things have gotten a lot better. And, and some of the things in the survey, like, are people trustworthy and all that kind of stuff.
Real character things.
Like, we actually have evidence that those haven't changed, right? And, again, when you ask about their own friends and family, people will tell you that they're better. The share of people saying that those are good are actually higher now. And yet here we are soaking in a sea of negativity every day.
Yep.
And wandering around and, bumping into people or talking to surveyors and basically saying, the world's terrible.
Yeah. A buddy of mine sent me a sticker for my coffee cup a couple of weeks ago that says, it gets worse before it gets worse. That kind of sums up our attitude in general. Before we go, I just want to take a brief moment to thank some important people on the podcast. Nick Mott, our editor and advisor extraordinaire and doer of a lot of things here at A New Angle, a dear friend and collaborator, is moving off of the team. He is leading up a new podcast effort at Montana Public Radio, so he will not be far. Keely Larson is stepping into Nick's role. And we have a new member of the team, Ella Hall, will be coming on and doing some production as well. So thank you to those folks. You'll actually be hearing Nick's voice on this segment next month, so stay tuned for that. Bryce, thanks as always, and we'll see you down the road.
Yep, see you guys next month.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. A New Angle is presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. With additional support from Consolidated Electrical Distributors, Drum Coffee, and Montana Public Radio. Keely Larson is our producer. Ella Hall is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music, and Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.